Welcome to aminacademy.com. Let us do life stories of scientists, and that we'll discuss about Gregor Mendel. Austrian botanist, teacher, and Augustinian prelate Gregor Mendel was the first to lay the mathematical foundation of the science of genetics in what came to be called Mendelism. As his father's only son, Mendel was expected to take over the small family farm, but they chose instead of to enter the Altbrunn monastery as a novitiate of the Augustinian order, where he was given the name Gregor. His birth name was Johann. The move to the monastery took him to Brunn, the capital of Moravia, where Mendel was introduced to a diverse and intellectual community. Abbot Cyril Knapp found him a substitute teaching position at Znaim, where he proved very successful. However, in 1850, Mendel failed on exam introduced through a new legislation for teacher certification and was sent to the University of Vienna for 2 years to benefit from a new program of scientific instructions. Mendel devoted his time at Vienna to physics and mathematics, working under Austrian physicist Christian Doppler and mathematical physicist Andreas von Ettinghausen. He also studied the anatomy and physiology of plants and the use of the microscope under botanist Franz Unger, an enthusiast for the cell theory and supporter of the development. In 1854, Abbot Cyril Knapp permitted Mendel to plan a major experimental program, his hybridization at the monastery. The aim of this program was to trace the transmission of hereditary characteristics in successive generations of hybrid progeny. Previous authorities had observed that progeny of fertile hybrids tended to revert to the originating species, and they had therefore concluded that hybridization could not be a mechanism used by nature to multiply species, though in exceptional cases some fertile hybrids did appear not to revert. Mendel closed to conduct his studies with the edible pea because of the numerous distinct varieties, the ease of culture and control of pollination, and the high proportion of successful seed germinations. In the numerous progeny he raised from these hybrids, however, the recessive character reappeared and the proportion of offspring bearing the dominant of offspring bearing the recessive was very close to a 3 to 1 ratio. Mendel's approach to experimentation came from his training in physics and mathematics, especially combinatorial mathematics. Mendel realized further that he could test his expectation that the seven traits are transmitted independently of one another. Crosses involving first two and then three of his seven traits yielded categories of offspring in proportion following the term produced from combining two binomial equations, indicating that their transmission was independent of the one another. Mendel's successor have called his conclusion the law of independent assortment. Rediscovery in 1900, Dutch botanist and geneticist Hugo de Vries, German botanist and geneticist Carl Erich Correns, and Austrian botanist Erich Chesmar von Seyssing independently reported result of hybridization experiments similar to Mendel's, through each latter claimed not to have known of Mendel's work while doing their own experiments. However, both De Vries and Correns had read Mendel earlier. Correns even made detailed notes on the subject but had forgotten. In Great Britain, biologist William Bateson became the leading proponent of Mendel's theory. Around him gathered the enthusiastic band of flowers. However, Darwinian evolution was assumed to be based chiefly on the selection of small blending variations, whereas Mendel worked with the clearly non-blending variations. The distinction between the characteristics and its determinant was not consistently made by Mendel or by his successors, the early Mendelians. Now we'll discuss further about Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel's that experiments involved breeding pea plants with different traits to study how traits are inherited. He observed the traits in the offspring and counted how many plants had each trait. Mendel's experiment led to the discovery of the laws of inheritance, including the law of dominance, law of segregation, and law of independent assortment. Mendel's experiments. Breeding. Mendel bred pea planets with different traits such as red and white flowers or smooth and wrinkled peas. Cross-pollination. Mendel manually transferred pollen from the one plant to another to create hybrids. Self-pollination. Mendel allowed plants to self-fertilize naturally. Counting. Mendel counted the number of plants that had each trait. Observing. Mendel observed how traits appeared in the offspring. Mendel's discoveries. Genes come in pairs, one from each parent. One from the trait can conceal another form of the first generation after a cross. Traits are inherited independently. There are mathematical patterns of inheritance from one generation to the next. Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk in the 19th century who worked out the basic laws of inheritance through experiments with pea plants. In his monastery garden, Mendel performed thousands of crosses with pea plants, discoveries how characteristics are passed down from one generation to the next, namely dominant and recessive traits. Mendel's early experiments provided the basis of modern genetics. John Gregor Mendel, we know that Mendel's modes of inheritance, especially dominant and recessive using single genes, are only one of the few ways that genes can influence traits. While Mendel's fundamental findings are extremely important, the inheritance of many traits is much more complicated. Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel, through his work on pea planets, discovered the fundamental laws of inheritance. He deduced that genes come in pairs and are inherited as distinct units, one from each parent. Mendel tracked the segregation of parental genes and their appearance in the offspring as dominant or recessive traits. He recognized the mathematical pattern of inheritance from one generation to the next. Mendel's law of heredity are usually stated as the first law. The law of segregation. Each inherited trait is defined by a gene pair. Parental genes are randomly separated to the sex cells so that sex cells contain only one gene of the pair. Offspring therefore inherit one genetic allele from each parent and sex cells unite in fertilization. Second one, the law of the independent assortment. Genes or different traits are sorted separately from one another so that the inheritance of one trait is not independent on the inheritance of another. The law of dominance. An organism which alternate forms of gene will express the form that is dominant. The genetic experiments Mendel did with pea plants took him 8 years and he published his results in 1865. During this time, Mendel grew over 10,000 pea plants, keeping track of progeny, number, and type. Mendel's work and his law of inheritance were not appreciated in his time. It was not until 1900, after the rediscovery of his law, that his experimental results were understood. So far, we discussed about the scientist Gregor Mendel. We have done. Please subscribe our YouTube channel.